So here is a congressional bill honoring Emma Smith and Joseph Smith by paying off their debts in 1856 after Joseph Smith's death and while Emma was married to Brigham. And why did this occur? Well, as I've stated before, Joseph Smith and Emma Smith were agents of the United States, and their bills and debts were paid off while Brigham Young was thrown out of the United States by William Douglas, who was the sponsor of this bill in honor of Emma Brigham and her former husband, Joseph Smith. A divorce involving the adultery of Brigham Young, and this occurred, according to courthouse testimony, as early as August 1844. Brigham Young was practicing polygamy in Nauvoo in public. Oh, I correct myself. Adultery, wife swapping. Not the Middle Eastern form of harem polygamy, but he was practicing adultery and wife swapping 2 months after Joseph Smith's death. Openly. He was practicing it openly rather than in secret, because according to court records, in 1843, Augusta Cobb and Brigham Young, Augusta Cobb, were cohabiting in secret in Nauvoo. Now recall, Joseph Smith, who decried and denounced polygamy up until his death of June 27, 1844, did not practice openly any form of polygamy. But the minute that he dies, within 2 months, Brigham Young and his Quorum of the 12 have turned literally Nauvoo into a brothel. And this involves a woman who was living in open adultery in Nauvoo in Brigham Young's home, who was married to a man in Boston. And Henrietta Cobb would travel between Boston a couple months and then decide she wants to live with Brigham Young and return to Nauvoo, back and forth 4 different times. Now, the witness in this case is Elder Adams, a Mormon, and listen to him clearly as he gives his testimony, I believe only 2 years after Joseph Smith's death. He claims that Brigham Young usurped Joseph Smith, that Brigham Young practiced this open form of polygamy, and Joseph Smith never did. And that he told Henrietta Cobb, he knew Henrietta Cobb, that this practice would lead to the devil. Cobb was promoting polygamy. And this is not polygamy, harem polygamy of Joseph Smith, that the fake Doctrine and Covenants 132 talks about 10 virgins type of polygamy. This was the Cochranite wife swapping, where you could move from bed to bed depending on whether or not you're in love with certain men. That women, as well as men, were free to sleep around. So how in the world do these ex-mos try and convince you that Joseph Smith, who was only accused of this Cochranite wife-swapping sort of polygamy, ever wrote a revelation about harem polygamy, where you could have 10 virgins? Joseph Smith, as far as I know, half of his quote-unquote spiritual wives were not virgins. So is Joseph Smith saying that if you sleep with a non-virgin, you're committing adultery, so you better... Well, Joseph Smith didn't even do this. That is ridiculous. So there were 3 forms of open marriage, alternative marriage, being practiced in Nauvoo during and after Joseph Smith. Number 1, the primary form was Cochranism, and I believe that this was being practiced in secret, that there were rumors of it, but Joseph Smith didn't actively engage in it. But he did have relatives that were married to former Cochranites who practiced this open form of marriage. I don't know if Lucy and her husband practiced it, but Lucy Smith's husband was a former Cochranite. But then the second form of polygamy that had been talked about by William Bennett was the Sisters of the Colored Veils. I can't remember exactly what they were called at the time, but William Bennett proposed a harem form of, not polygamy, it was harem form of temple prostitution, in which the women of Nauvoo would be divided into 3 levels, One would be the street prostitutes, they would be the white veils, the green veils would be just the women that could sleep around in cockronism, and then the black veil, I believe, were the highest form of the harem polygamy, Bennett, which they could be married only on the authorization of Joseph Smith. This is what Bennett proposed. It was rejected, and as we know, Bennett was excommunicated, thrown out of Nauvoo, and wrote an expose along with Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon and Bennett were almost tied at the hip. They were co-conspirators against Joseph Smith. And when Joseph Smith was murdered at Carthage, who should show up? The traveling duo of Sidney Rigdon and Bennett trying to take hold of the church. Of course, the Quorum of the 12 won favor of their British immigrants who just arrived in Nauvoo maybe 9 months before and had no place to go other than to follow Brigham Young into the hellscape of Utah. That hell on earth, directed by Satan on earth, Brigham Young. But I'll let this article talk for itself.
Mormon History. Adultery of Brigham Young, 1847. Quincy Whig, December 22, 1847. Supreme J. Court, Boston. Divorced from a woman who had become the spiritual wife of a Mormon leader. Henry Cobb versus Augusta Cobb. This was a libel alleging crim con on the part of the respondent with Brigham Young, in Nauvoo, in August, 1844, and December, 1845. After living 21 years in good repute with her lawful husband, the respondent became led away with Mormonism, leaving her husband, went to Nauvoo, and joined the church there. After a year's trial of the system she returned to Boston, but not being able to content herself there, she made another trip to Nauvoo, returned to Boston again, and again went off, and she is now supposed to be in California with Young. Her conduct in Nauvoo was fully described in the deposition of George J. Adams, better known under the name of Elder Adams, who testified that he knew Mrs. Cobb when she lived in the house of Brigham Young, at Nauvoo. We give the following extracts from the deposition. In the fall of 1844, after her return from Nauvoo to Boston, Mrs. Cobb said she loved Brigham Young better than she did Mr. Cobb, and, live or die, she was going to live with him at all hazards. This was in the course of a conversation in which she used extravagant language in favor of Mr. Young and against Mr. Cobb. Mrs. Cobb went out again to Nauvoo, the second time, and lived with Mr. Young, and their living together and their conduct was the subject of conversation in the society and out of the society. The subject of conversation, to which I have alluded, was that persons had a right to live together in unlawful intercourse, and Mrs. Cobb avowed her belief in this doctrine, and said it was right. In conversation with Mrs. Cobb on the subject of spiritual wives, I told her such doctrines would lead to the devil, and she said if it did she would go there with Brigham Young. The Mormons were so incensed with me for my opposition to this doctrine that they attempted to take my life in various ways. I think Mrs. Cobb was originally a woman of good feelings and good principles, but I do not think so of her now. I think she was led away by religious frenzy. She said, "I never will forsake Brother Young, come life or come death." She said that the doctrine taught by Brigham Young was a glorious doctrine, for if she did not love her husband, it gave her a man she did love. In the cross-examination, Mr. Adams stated that he performed on the stage when he was a young man, that he was a merchant tailor in extensive business before he joined the Mormons, that he has, since he withdrew, performed at the National Theater in this city, that Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, did not teach the doctrine of spiritual wives, that Brigham Young, in assuming to be president of the church, had usurped authority, and that he, Mr. Adams, opposed the usurpation. The testimony of Mr. Adams was corroborated by a widow lady, who had been to Nauvoo, and while there had taken the first degree in the mysteries of the Mormon Church. The second degree gave the privilege of spiritual wifehood. Mrs. Cobb took this degree, and urged the witness to take it, and spoke of her connection with Young. Judge Wild decreed a full divorce from the bonds of matrimony. Post. Note 1. Augusta Adams was born December 7, 1802 in Beverly, near Lynn, Essex, MA, and died February 3, 1886 in Salt Lake City, UT. She married Henry Cobb, December 22, 1822, in Charlton, Worcester, MA, and together they had 7 children. She was baptized a Mormon by Samuel H. Smith near Boston on June 29, 1832. Augusta apparently continued living with her non-Mormon husband and family until September 1843, when she left Massachusetts in company with LDS President of the 12, Brigham Young. Augusta's worshipful infatuation with President Young probably began well before her element with him. She gave her last child with Henry Cobb the suggestive name of Brigham. Brigham Cobb, was born in Massachusetts in late April 1843 and died October 12, 1843 in Cincinnati, while accompanying Augusta and Brigham Young to Nauvoo. Augusta married Brigham Young at Nauvoo on November 2, 1843.
So while Brigham Young was being thrown out of the United States on threat of being charged and convicted of murder and of adultery, Emma Bideman Smith, or Emma Smith, widow of Joseph Smith, was awarded a congressional relief bill to bail her out of the debts that she and Joseph Smith had incurred while they were doing government service in Nauvoo. So here is the congressional House bill. It's report number 66 in the House of Representatives, April 22, 1856, exactly when Brigham Young was concocting his libel against the Smiths for practicing polygamy, which he had been involved in, the Cochranism and the spiritual wifery doctrine, and trying to blame it on and accuse Joseph Smith, who was against it. But here we've got Mr. Giddings from the Committee of Claims reported the following bill for the relief of Emma Bideman. That's Emma Bideman, the widow of Joseph Smith. It is enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America in the Congress assembled, that there be paid to Emma Bideman by the Secretary of the Treasury out of any monies in the Treasury not otherwise appropriated, the sum of $197.35 with interest thereon from July 8, 1852, until paid in full the payment of the sum adjudged and decreed to her in lieu of the dower by the Circuit Court of the United States of the District of Illinois at the July term 1852 in the case of the United States versus Joseph Smith. Now, these relief bills were awarded by the Senate, not to traitors to the United States, but to people who have been deemed to have given service to the United States and so needed relief from being sued. And after the courts had exhausted all their protections, then the person can request that the United States provide them relief in these personal bills. These personal bills are given of relief are given to veterans of wars. They're given to people who have provided exemplary service to the United States or to their states. And it takes usually a congressman to introduce the bill. And at this point in time, I'm not sure if Stephen A. Douglas was still alive, but you know, Stephen Douglas and Joseph Smith were confidants and best friends. Stephen O. Douglas, one of the most prominent politicians of the United States leading up to the Civil War. We all remember the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So, while Emma Bideman was getting relief from the U.S. Congress to pay off her bills, Brigham Young was being thrown out of the United States on the condition that unless he left the United States, he would be prosecuted for murder and for adultery, kidnapping, and horse wrestling. He would stand trial and probably face the death penalty. Of course, Brigham Young, no man of honor or bravery, skedaddled out of Nauvoo, leaving everybody high and dry with property they purchased and were unable to sell because the Exile of the Saints happened within a night or a few days. And they had to leave and go into winter quarters, I believe, was outside the United States at that time, in Iowa. So what was the reason for this? Well, that's because Emma Beideman and her husband, Joseph Smith, were United States agents for the North against the South during the Civil War. Joseph Smith was a pro-freedom, anti-Masonic party Whig. He